So when you wake up in the morning, you don't think of it as political, right? That's the first thing. I mean, you don't open your eyes and think to yourself, what a beautiful morning inside a complex web of public infrastructure, regulatory enforcement, and market stabilization. At least I hope you don't do that. I don't think anybody does that. You wake up, maybe hit the snooze once or twice, then turn the light on, maybe check your phone, stumble into the kitchen like a confused zombie looking for your caffeine. You turn on the faucet, water comes out, clean water, safe enough that you don't have to stand there in existential dread every morning anyway, wondering whether today is the day your sink starts to dispense cholera. You check the weather, you trust it enough to decide whether to grab a jacket. You head out the door, get on the road. Maybe you hit some potholes, depending on where you live. But at least it's recognizable as a road and not like a post-apocalyptic suggestion. Maybe at some point in the day you stop for groceries, you buy food without having to personally inspect the meat with the flashlight and a chemistry set. Maybe your paycheck hits your bank account. Maybe you use your debit card. Maybe you gripe about prices. And fair enough, but the whole machine is functioning well enough that your day moves forward without you having to think much about the scaffolding that's holding it up. And that's exactly the point. The stuff that works quietly starts to become invisible. The more normal it feels, the less you're going to notice it. Clean water is normal. Roads are normal. Food safety is normal. Weather alerts, normal. Retirement benefits for seniors are normal. Banking protections are normal. The fact that planes don't routinely drop out of the sky because some airline accountant decided that maintenance was a little too expensive this quarter, that's also become normal. We live inside systems so familiar that they disappear into the wallpaper of everyday life. They only become visible when they fail, when something gets contaminated, when a bridge collapses, when a storm hits without warning, if a corporation cuts a corner and people end up hurt. Then, all of a sudden, everyone remembers that these things do not maintain themselves by magic. And yet, if you listen to a certain kind of political rhetoric, especially from the right, you hear a very different story. You hear that government is the problem, that regulation is strangling freedom, that public programs are soft and wasteful, suspiciously un-American. And hovering over all of it, like, some sort of monster they keep insisting is definitely real this time, is the word socialism. Socialism is the threat. Socialism is the danger. Socialism is apparently lurking behind every school lunch, every safety inspection, every attempt to keep a chemical company from polluting a river. Here's the question I want to ask today. If socialism is the great menace, why does so much of modern American life depend on systems built, maintained, or regulated by the public sector? And maybe even more importantly, why do we call some of these things socialism while we treat others as just part of life? Because here's the thing. A lot of this argument is built on fog, not facts or definitions, not honest distinctions, but fog. The word socialism has been turned into a catch-all insult, a political jump scare, a kind of all-purpose boogeyman that gets dragged out whenever someone proposes that maybe corporations should not be allowed to do this or that, sell poison food, exploit workers, wreck the environment, leave sick people bankrupt in the name of shareholder profits. But words are supposed to mean something. If we're going to argue about socialism and capitalism and regulation and public programs, then we ought to know what those things actually are. Otherwise, we're not having a debate. We're just throwing haunted vocabulary at each other and hoping nobody notices. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. I want to slow this down and pull it apart. What socialism actually is, what it's not, what kind of system we actually live in, why public safeguards exist in the first place, why the profit motive, left completely unchecked, has a nasty little habit of treating safety as an annoying expense, and why so many people who swear they hate socialism are, in practice, relying every single day on public systems and protections they would absolutely notice the moment they disappeared. Because we're not actually having the conversation that many politicians would like you to think we are. We're not standing at the edge of a socialist takeover. We're living in a capitalist country with public programs, guardrails, and regulations layered on top for reasons that did not appear out of nowhere. They appeared because markets can do a lot of things well, but left to themselves, they also have a tendency to cut corners, create victims, and call it efficiency. And if we can't even tell the difference between a socialist system and a capitalist system that has social programs, then we're not just confused. We're apparently easy to manipulate. That confusion is useful to people who benefit from keeping the public scared of the wrong things. So let's clear the fog. Let's talk about the system you're actually living in, not the cartoon version that you keep getting sold. Because a lot of people are terrified of a word they do not understand, while depending every day on structures that they've been taught not to see. Hello, all. You are listening to a Friday edition of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. The podcast about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, and I am your host. And today, the subject is socialism. Not socialism in the sense of the buzzword you hear in political debates and at political rallies, but socialism in reality. And before we go any further, I want to start off by slowing this down so we can get our footing, because this entire conversation collapses if we don't agree on what we're even talking about. And right now, in the broader political conversations, people are not using the same definitions. Not even close. The word socialism gets thrown around like it's self-explanatory, like everyone hears it and pictures the same thing. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is that people are reacting to a feeling, not a definition. So that seems like a good place to start. When most people hear the word socialism, what do they picture? Not academically, not what you find in a textbook. I mean instinctively. What pops into their head? For a lot of people, especially in the United States, that word carries a certain kind of weight. It brings up images of government control, shortages of things, loss of freedom, maybe something from history class that felt sort of ominous and distant, but was clearly not us, not American. And right here is where the confusion begins, because a lot of that imagery is not actually socialism. What people are often picturing in that scenario is communism, or at least a Cold War version of it that has been burned into the American imagination for decades. Now, those two ideas are certainly related. Communism grows out of socialist theory, particularly from the work of Karl Marx. But they are absolutely not interchangeable. Communism is a very specific vision, one that imagines a classless society with no private ownership whatsoever, and no private ownership of major production, predominantly, at least in theory, there's no state at all. In practice, historically, it has often involved highly centralized governments and strict political control, which is part of why that image that we get is so strong. But socialism, as a concept, is broader than that. It's not one fixed system with one fixed outcome. It's an umbrella of ideas about how an economy can be organized. At its core, socialism is about one question: who owns and controls the major parts of the economy? That's the center of it. Under socialism, key industries and systems, things like energy, transportation, healthcare, large-scale manufacturing, are all owned or controlled collectively rather than privately. That collective control can take different forms. Sometimes it's the state, sometimes it's worker-owned cooperatives, sometimes it's a mix of the two. But the guiding principle is that these systems exist primarily to serve public needs rather than to maximize profit. Now, contrast that with capitalism. Under capitalism, those same industries are largely owned by private individuals or corporations. The decisions are driven by profit. If something makes money, it expands. If it doesn't, it disappears. That right there is the engine. That's what drives everything: innovation, competition, efficiency, growth, you name it. And again, there's no moral judgment here in what I'm saying. It's just how the system is designed. Capitalism is incredibly good at generating wealth and innovation. It is also, by design, focused on the concept of return on investment. That's the trade-off that's built into it. And this is where we need to sort of plant a flag, because this is the sentence that clears up a lot of confusion if you actually sit with it for a second. Socialism is not the government does stuff. It is not the existence of public programs. It's not regulation. It's not infrastructure. It's about ownership and control of core economic engine. If the government runs a retirement program, that is not socialism. If the government enforces safety standards, that is not socialism. If the government builds roads, again, not socialism. Those are functions that can exist inside many different kinds of systems, including capitalist ones. Now, the reason this matters is because once you lose that definition, once you let socialism expand to mean anything the government touches, the word stops being useful. It becomes a political shortcut. Just a label you can slap on anything you don't like without having to explain why you don't like it. And when that happens, the conversation loses substance and wanders into something that's emotional and reactive. People aren't debating systems at that point. They're reacting to a word that has been loaded with decades of fear and messaging. So before we move in, just lock this in. Socialism is about collective ownership or control of major economic systems. Capitalism is about private ownership and profit-driven decisions. Everything else we're going to talk about, the programs, the regulations, the safety nets, those exist within systems. They don't define the systems. And if we don't keep that distinction clear, we end up arguing about something that isn't actually on the table. So let's talk about what socialism is not. Now that we've got a working definition, now we can start clearing away the noise. And there is a lot of noise around this word. Because this is where things get stretched. This is where socialism stops being a specific idea about ownership and control of the economy and starts getting used like duct tape. It gets slapped onto anything involving the government, whether it fits or not. Socialism is not roads. It's not firefighters. It's not the fact that you can call 911 and someone actually shows up. And it's definitely not your Social Security check. Now, let's take that one for a second because it gets labeled all the time. When someone retires and starts receiving benefits through Social Security, what is that really? It's not the government taking over industries. It's not the government owning the means of production. It's a public insurance program. You pay into it over time, then you receive the benefits later. It's designed to prevent elderly poverty. That's the goal. It exists within a system that is otherwise overwhelmingly private and market-driven. Same thing with healthcare programs administered through Medicare and Medicaid. These are government-run programs, yes, but they operate inside a healthcare system that is almost exclusively private. Hospitals, for the most part, are private. Doctors are private. Insurance companies are private. Pharmaceutical companies are definitely private. The presence of a public program inside that system does not suddenly flip the entire structure to socialism. And then there's regulation. This is where the word gets thrown around almost reflexively. Safety rules, environmental protections, consumer standards, all of those things get labeled as socialism by certain politicians. But again, go back to the definition that we just laid out. Is the government owning those industries? No. Is it controlling the entire economic output of those sectors? No. What it's doing is setting boundaries. It's saying you can operate, you can make money, but here are the lines that you can't cross. Agencies like the Food and Drug Administration exist for a reason. And we'll get more into that reason in a minute. But at a basic level, what they do is enforce standards so that when you buy food or medication, you're not taking your life into your own hands every time you open a package. That is not socialism. That's a rule book. And that's really the simplest way to think about this. But public services and regulations are not about ownership of the economy. They have nothing to do with that. They're about shaping how that economy operates. They're guardrails. They're conditions. They're the difference between anything goes and there are limits. So when someone says that's socialism because there's a public school or a safety inspection or a retirement program, what they're actually doing is collapsing two completely different ideas into one word incorrectly. They're taking something that exists inside a capitalist framework and labeling it as if it defines the entire system. And when you do that, once everything becomes socialism, the word ceases to mean anything real. It stops being a useful description and starts just being a reaction, a buzzword. It becomes shorthand for government involvement I don't like, rather than a real discussion about whatever the topic is specifically. So here's the key takeaway before I move on. Public programs are not socialism. Regulations are not socialism. Government services are not socialism. Those are tools. They exist in capitalist systems, mixed systems, and yes, even in some socialist systems, depending on how they're structured. But by themselves, they do not tell you what kind of system you're living in. We need to keep that distinction clear. One side, if we don't, one side is talking about an entire economic system, then the other side is pointing at a school lunch program and calling it the same thing. Those two things are not the same conversation, not even close. So, what do we actually have here? All right, now that we've cleared some space and knocked down a few of the misconceptions, let's talk about the system that we're actually living in. Not the one that we get warned about at election time, not the one people imagine, but the real one. Because this is where the conversation usually starts to drift. People argue about socialism and capitalism and government overreach, and they're often not even describing the same reality. So let's name it clearly. The United States is not a socialist country. It is a capitalist system with public programs and guardrails layered on top. That's the structure right there. That's the machine that you're living inside of. And it helps to break that down into pieces, because once you see the layers, it stops feeling abstract and starts feeling, well, obvious. At the center of everything is capitalism. That's the engine. Most businesses in this country are privately owned, the vast majority of them. Companies decide what to produce, how to produce it, and what to charge for it. They compete with each other. They innovate. They expand or fail based on whether they can turn a profit. That's the system. That's the core dynamic. That's why you have the range of products and services and choices that you do. It's why new ideas can take off quickly. It's why there's constant pressure to improve and to cut costs and to stay ahead. But that isn't the whole system. Layered on top of that engine are public programs. These are the parts of the system that step in where the market either doesn't reach or doesn't function particularly well on its own. Things like retirement, basic health care access for certain populations anyway, public education, infrastructure. These aren't replacing the market. They're filling the gaps. They're addressing needs that don't always align neatly with profit. Because here's the reality. In a purely profit-driven system, if something isn't profitable, it tends not to exist. Or at least it exists in a limited way, or at a price that excludes many people. That's not a moral failure. That's just how the incentives are structured. Public programs exist because there are areas where leaving everything to market creates outcomes that a lot of people don't find acceptable. And then there's the third layer, regulation. This is where the system sets boundaries. Not ownership, not control, boundaries. What goes into your food? What chemicals can be released into the air or water? What safety standards workplaces have to meet? What financial institutions are allowed to do with your money? These rules don't replace the market. They shape the market. They define the conditions under which businesses can operate. And this is where that earlier point starts to connect. When people point to any one of these layers and they say that's socialism, they're skipping over the structure entirely. They're ignoring the fact that the overwhelming majority of economic activity in this country is still driven by private ownership and profit. The existence of guardrails doesn't change what the engine is. It just changes how far off course it can be allowed to go. Think about it this way. If you're driving a car, the fact that there are speed limits and traffic lights and seatbelt laws doesn't mean the government owns your car. It means there are rules about how you use it because there are consequences when there are no rules. It's the same idea. The system we have is not about replacing capitalism. It's about containing it, channeling it, letting it do what it does while putting limits around where it can cause harm. And that's the part that often gets lost in the political rhetoric. Because once everything gets flattened into, government equals socialism, you lose the ability to talk about how the system actually functions. You lose nuance. You lose the ability to ask better questions like, where are the guide rails working? Where are they failing? Where do they need to be adjusted? Instead, you end up stuck in this binary argument that doesn't match reality. We don't live in a system where the government owns everything. We don't live in a system where the market operates without constraint. We live somewhere in between. A capitalist system with guardrails. And the next question, the one that really matters, is why those guardrails exist in the first place. So now we get to the part that I think is what really matters. Not just what the system looks like, but why it looks that way. Because those guardrails we just talked about, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. Nobody woke up one morning and thought, you know what would be fun? Let's create a bunch of rules and paperwork and make everyone's life more complicated. That isn't how it happened. Those guardrails exist because of how the engine works. And again, it's important to be fair here again. Businesses are designed to maximize profit. That is their purpose. That's what they're built to do. If you're running a company, you are under constant pressure to increase revenue, cut costs, satisfy your investors, and stay competitive with other companies. There's no moral judgment here. That is the structure. That's the incentive system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. But here's the thing. If your priority is to maximize profit and safety costs money, there is always going to be pressure to cut that corner. Not because people are cartoon villains. I mean, they exist, but it's not because every CEO wakes up thinking about how to harm someone, but because the system rewards efficiency, and safety often looks like inefficiency on a balance sheet. It's an expense. It's something that doesn't generate revenue. And when you're competing against other companies that are also trying to lower costs and increase margins, that pressure doesn't just go away. If anything, it builds. And over time, without limits, that pressure leads to decisions. Small ones at first, then bigger ones. Cheaper materials, fewer inspections, longer hours, less oversight. Eventually, sometimes these things end up causing real harm. And that's where regulation comes in. Not as an abstract idea, but as a response. Agencies like the Food and Drug Administration didn't appear because everything was going great. They exist because, historically, there were unsafe foods and contaminated products and misleading labels and people getting sick or worse. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration exists because workplaces were dangerous in ways that most people today would probably find shocking. Injuries and fatalities, conditions that were simply accepted as part of various jobs. The Environmental Protection Agency exists because pollution wasn't some distant theoretical problem. It was happening in rivers, in the air, in communities that didn't have the power to push back. None of these rules were written in a vacuum. They were written after something went wrong. And that's the line I want you to sit with for a second, because it reframes the entire conversation. Regulations don't appear out of thin air. Regulation showed up after something went wrong. Every rule, every safety standard, every inspection requirement is a reaction. It's a correction. It's the system saying we tried this without limits and here's what happened. Now, that doesn't mean that every regulation is perfect. It doesn't mean that the system always gets it right. There are inefficient rules. There are outdated policies. There are cases where bureaucracy slows things down more than it helps. All those are real. That's part of the conversation too. But the idea that these guardrails are arbitrary or unnecessary or, purely ideological, that doesn't hold up when you look at why they were created in the first place. Because without them, the same pressures are still there. The drive to reduce costs, the incentive to increase profit, the temptation to take risks that don't show up immediately, but eventually land somewhere. And when people talk about deregulation, as if it's always the key to growth. What often gets left out is the other side of that equation. Growth for who? And at what cost? And who absorbs that cost when something goes wrong? That cost doesn't disappear. It just moves. Sometimes it moves to workers. Sometimes it moves to consumers. Sometimes it moves to entire communities, but it doesn't go away. So those guardrails, they're not there to replace the system. They're there because of the system. They exist because a profit-driven system left completely unchecked has a tendency to push right up to the edge of what it can get away with. And sometimes it steps over that edge. When that happens, history has shown us what comes next. The question isn't whether those pressures exist. The question is, what do we do about them? Now, to be fair, I want to spend some time on the other side of this because there is an argument here. And if you ignore it, you lose credibility. The case for deregulation isn't coming out of nowhere. People who make that argument, again, they're not all cartoon villains twirling mustaches and dreaming about dumping chemicals into rivers. The argument, at its best, goes something like this. Too many rules can slow things down. They can make it harder to start a business. They can create layers of bureaucracy that are inefficient and expensive and often outdated. If you pile enough of those on, you can choke off innovation. You can make it harder for small companies to even think about competing. You can create a system where the rules are so complicated that navigating them becomes as important as actually building something of value. That is not a crazy argument. There is truth in it. Anyone who's dealt with red tape in any form knows that systems can become bloated. Rules can stick around long after the problem they were designed to fix has changed. Agencies can slow down, processes can become frustrating, and when that happens, it's reasonable to ask whether the balance is off. So yes, there is a legitimate conversation to be had about how much regulation is too much. Which rules make sense, which ones don't, and how to keep systems responsive rather than rigid. But here's where the argument often takes a turn, because somewhere along the way, some regulations may be excessive, turns into regulation is the problem. And then that becomes less regulation is always better. And that's a big leap. And that's where things start to fall apart. Because that argument ignores the origin story that I just talked about. It ignores the fact that these rules didn't appear out of nowhere for no reason. They appeared because at some point something went wrong. People got hurt, people got sick, people lost jobs or homes or lives because of the fact that there were no limits in place. So when someone says we should roll back regulation, the real question isn't just will that make things more efficient? It's also what problem was this rule solving in the first place? And what happens if that problem comes back? That's the part that gets skipped. Because deregulation can absolutely create growth in certain areas. It can lower costs. It can speed things up. It can open space for new players. But it can also reintroduce problems and risks that the regulations were designed to manage. And this is where I want to give you a line that I think reframes the whole thing in a way that's sort of hard to ignore. Every regulation is a receipt. It's proof that someone, somewhere, paid the price for not having it. Now, that doesn't mean every receipt needs to stay forever. Some of them could very well be outdated. Some of them might be for problems that have evolved. But before you throw them away, you need to understand what was purchased with them. Because otherwise, you're not just simplifying the system, you're forgetting its history, and doing that means you run the risk of repeating it. So the real conversation isn't regulation versus no regulation. That's not a serious conversation. The real conversation should be about balance, where the line should be between efficiency and protection, between speed and safety, between profit and accountability. And that brings us to the part of the conversation where things usually get the most confused and then the most heated, because this is where people start using the word socialism to describe things that don't fit that definition at all. Right? This is the moment where I'm hoping everything starts to click, because up to this point, we've talked about definitions and about structure, about why regulations exist, about the tension between profit and protection, but now we need to bring all of that together into one clean distinction. And if you take nothing else from this episode, this is the part to hold on to. There is a difference between social programs and a socialist system. They are not the same thing, not even close. And treating them like they are is what keeps this entire conversation stuck in the weeds. So let's walk through it. What do we actually have in the United States? We have programs like Social Security administered by the Social Security Administration. We have healthcare programs like Medicare and Medicaid overseen by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We have public schools. We have infrastructure. We have regulatory agencies making sure that when you buy food or take medication or go to work or turn on your faucet, that there are at least some baseline protections in place. All of those things exist. They are real. They are part of the system. And they are, in a broad sense, examples of government involvement in the economy and in people's lives. But they are not the same thing as a socialist system. Because what we do not have is government ownership of these industries. The federal government does not own the vast majority of businesses in the country. It does not control production across the economy. It does not eliminate private enterprise. It does not set prices for everything or decide what gets produced and in what quantity across the sectors. Those are the kind of characteristics you would expect to see in a fully socialist system, depending on how it's implemented. That's what we talked about earlier when we defined socialism as being about ownership and control of the core economic engine. That is not the system we are living in. What we have instead is a capitalist system with public programs layered into it. Programs that exist to provide stability, reduce risk, address gaps that the market doesn't naturally fill on its own. They don't replace the market. They operate alongside of it. And once you see that clearly, the labeling then starts to look off, because when someone points to a public school or a retirement program or a safety regulation and says, that's socialism, what they're doing is taking a single component of a mixed system and pretending it defines the entire thing. It's like pointing at a seatbelt and saying, this car is actually a government vehicle now. That is not how it works. And this is where the language problem really starts to matter. Because when everything else gets labeled socialism, the word stops being descriptive and starts being emotional. It becomes a way to signal disapproval rather than a way to explain how something works. It short circuits the conversation. Instead of asking, does this program work, or is it inefficient, or is it fair, does it solve a real problem, the conversation jumps straight to, is this socialism? And once that label is applied, for many people, the discussion is over. That's it, before it even begins. That is not analysis. That is a reflex. That is a knee-jerk reaction. And it matters because it makes it harder to have honest conversations about what should exist inside a system like ours. About what protections people need, about where the market works well and where it doesn't. About how to balance individual responsibility with shared risk. If we can't even separate social programs from socialism as a system, then we're not debating policy anymore. We're just reacting to a word that's been stretched so far it barely means anything at all. So let's bring it back to something simple before we move on. We have social programs. We do not have a socialist system. Those are two very different things. And until we keep that distinction clear, we're going to keep talking past each other instead of actually dealing with the real questions that are underneath all of this. So, the political claim. Let's talk about the political claim. Let's deal with the part that's sitting just under the surface of all of this. Because if you've listened to political rhetoric over the last, I don't know, decades, but especially the last few years, you've heard this claim over and over again. That liberals, progressives, Democrats, more broadly, want to turn the United States into a socialist country. That's the warning. That's the fear that they monger. That's the headline version of the argument. So let's actually look at that. What are the policies that usually get pointed to when people say this? Expanding access to healthcare, lowering prescription drug costs, investing in infrastructure, strengthening retirement systems, funding education, adding regulations in areas where harm has been identified, raising taxes in certain brackets to pay for those things. That's the typical list. Maybe not the whole list, but I'm hitting the high points. And if you take those one at a time and you look at how they're structured, what you find is that most of them are not about replacing the capitalist system in any way. They're about modifying it, adjusting it, putting more protection into it. Take the Affordable Care Act as an example. That law expanded access to health care, created marketplaces, and added protections for people with pre-existing conditions. But it did all of that while keeping private insurance companies at the center of the system. It didn't nationalize anything. It didn't nationalize hospitals. It didn't eliminate private insurers. It worked within the existing structure. Now, you can argue about whether or not it worked well or if it worked well enough. You can argue about the cost and the complexity and the outcomes. Those things are a real debate. But calling it a move towards socialism doesn't line up with what it actually did. And that pattern holds across a lot of policy discussions. Most proposals you hear from mainstream liberal or progressive circles are about expanding coverage, increasing access, strengthening safety nets, or adjusting regulations. They are not about the government taking ownership of the entire economy. They are not about eliminating private business. They are not about central planning of production across all sectors. That's just not what's being proposed. Now, that doesn't mean everyone agrees with those policies. That doesn't mean that they're all good ideas. It doesn't mean that there aren't trade-offs and costs and unintended consequences. There absolutely are. And those things are worth debating. But here's where the framing starts to matter, because when everything gets labeled socialism, it changes the conversation. It turns a policy debate into an ideological alarm bell. It shifts the focus away from the details and toward a kind of immediate rejection. And this is where I want to sharpen something just a little bit. Calling everything socialism isn't analysis. It's a way to shut the conversation down before it starts. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that I think that that's often the point of using that word. Because if the label itself is enough to trigger a reaction, then you don't have to engage with the substance. You don't have to ask whether a policy works or whether it really solves a problem or whether it creates new ones, whether it could be improved. You just categorize it, reject it, and move on. And that's useful. It's useful politically, especially if you're trying to keep the conversation framed in a certain way. You can convince people that any expansion of public programs or regulation is a step towards something dangerous. And then you don't have to argue each proposal on its own merits. You don't have to come up with alternatives. You can group them all together under a single loaded word and let that word do all the work. But that only works if people accept the premise. If people don't stop and ask, no, wait a second, what does that word actually mean? And then the label sticks. And once it sticks, the conversation is all but over. So let's bring this back to where we've been building throughout this whole episode. We do not live in a socialist system. We live in a capitalist system with public programs and guardrails. And most of the policies that are being debated right now are about where to place those guardrails, how strong they should be, and who they protect. That right there is the real conversation, not whether the country is about to become something it isn't, but how the system we already have should function and who it should work for. And once you see that clearly, once you separate the label from the reality, it becomes a lot easier to actually engage with the debate instead of just reacting to it. All right, so let's bring this all the way back around, because if you zoom out from everything we talked about, the definitions, the myths, the structure of the system, the role of regulation, the way the word gets used, what you're left with is something a lot simpler than the noise makes it seem. We're not actually arguing about capitalism versus socialism. Not really. We're arguing about where the line should be. How much risk should people carry on their own, and how much should be shared? That's the real question sitting underneath all of this. Because capitalism as a system is very good at certain things. Again, innovation, competition, it generates wealth, it rewards efficiency, it gives people the ability to build, to create, to expand. All of that's real, and all of that matters. But it also has edges, it has blind spots. And one of those blind spots is that it does not naturally account for people who aren't profitable to serve. It doesn't automatically prioritize safety if safety cuts into profit margins. It doesn't always absorb the cost of harm when that harm can be pushed somewhere else, whether it be workers or consumers or communities. That's not a moral failure of individuals, generally speaking. That's the incentive structure doing exactly what it was designed to do, which is why the guardrails exist. Not to replace the system, not to shut it down, but to keep it from running too far in a direction that creates damage. And once you understand that, once you see the system as it is actually existing instead of how people describe it, the conversation can become real. Because now the question isn't, are you for capitalism or socialism? That's not a serious frame for what we're talking about. The real question is, what kind of capitalism do you want to live in? One where the market operates with minimal interference, even if that means more volatility and inequality and more risk being pushed onto individuals, or one where there are stronger protections, more shared responsibility, more intervention when things do go wrong. There isn't a zero-cost answer to that. Every choice comes with trade-offs. The more regulation you have can mean more protection, but also more complexity. Less regulation can mean more flexibility, but it can also mean more risk. That's the balance. And that should be the real debate. But we can't have that debate honestly if we're using words that don't mean what they actually mean. If socialism becomes a label for anything involving the public sector, then the conversation is already off the rails before it even starts. We're not talking about systems anymore. We're reacting to buzzwords that are loaded with decades of fear and politics and shorthand messaging. And that confusion is not harmless, because when people are afraid of the wrong thing, they stop asking the right questions. They stop looking at how the system actually works. They stop examining, what helps and what doesn't, and where things need to be adjusted. And that makes it a lot easier for the conversation to stay exactly where it is, stuck in the mud. So maybe the takeaway here isn't about picking a side in some abstract ideological battle. Maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just about understanding the system you're actually living in. clearly enough that you can actually have a real opinion about it. Because you can't draw the line honestly if you're afraid of a word that you don't actually understand. All right, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time to download and listen to this episode of Back Porch Files from your neighbor on the left. I'm so happy that you did, and I'd want to hear from you. I want to hear what you think about this topic. What do you think of when you hear the word socialism? Does it match what I described? Go to the website, www.neighborontheleft.com. Go to the contacts page and use either one of the social media platforms to send a direct message, or use the email address to email and let me know where you're at. Let me know what you think. Comments, critiques, compliments, questions, whatever you have, I want to hear them. You can also, while you're on the website, you can check out the episodes page where you can stream or download any episode of the podcast. And there's also the blog section of the website that has mirrored posts that go with each of the topics from the various episodes, including all of the sources that I use for the things that I talk about. I'll be back on Monday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So between now and then, stay engaged, stay kind, and have the kind of week you'd wish for others.